Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Sparta Thrives Together event, fostering resiliency in anxious youth. And for today, our guest speaker is Tyler Romero, and he is from Cherry Health. He is a mental health clinician, and he's been providing therapy for families since 2020. And he is here to share with you about addressing anxiety in our youth. Can you give him a warm welcome? Thank you.
All right, so we've been having some tech issues, so just bear with me. There's a little bit of a delay, so you'll see what I'm talking about in eventually. So like Cinda said, my name's Tyler. I've been practicing mental health therapy for the last 5 years or so. Prior to that, I got my bachelor's degree in social work, and in between getting my master's degree, I worked for an organization that helped provide services to adults that have developmental disabilities, but I was also a community coordinator for KSSN. So it's kind of like full circle that this was helped organized by KSSN, and now I'm here with all of you parents. Now that I'm done talking about the things on this slide, you'll just have to deal with it. When I was working at KSSN, I was placed in the Granville School District. And what a lot of the teachers were saying to me is in the later grade school ages, like 5th and 6th grade, these students were just mean to each other, and that like more than normal. So the 6th grade teachers came to me and asked me like, hey, what can we do to help improve this? So we decided that 1 hour a week I would come into the class and we would do different activities that helped foster what's called social emotional learning. And I'll talk a little bit about more of what that is later on. But the simple definition is teaching children how to understand their emotions and how it influences their social interaction with other people. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that later on how that relates to anxious youth and how that is impacted by screens. So with the previous workshop that happened, it's my understanding that one of the points that was talked about was how screens influence stress and anxiety for children. But the reality is screens increase stress and anxiety for all individuals. And once the slide goes onto it, you'll see a visual on how that, and why that is that I'll talk about in a minute. But have any of you seen the documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma? Okay, a few of you. If you haven't seen it, I would really encourage you to watch it because it does a really good job of giving evidence-based information on the negative impacts of screens, specifically with social media. But it talks a lot about how a lot of these tech companies do whatever they can to keep children, adults, teenagers, keep their eyes on the screen as much as possible. And what that does is it causes dopamine hits. Dopamine is a chemical in the brain that is basically a pleasure receptor. Each time, like on social media, each time you get a like on a picture, there's a small dopamine hit. Each time there's something new that comes up, there's a small dopamine hit. Each time you scroll up to a new reel, there's a dopamine hit because it's something new. And what a lot of preliminary research is showing is that the influx of this dopamine that is readily available just from a screen, individuals don't know what to do when that's not there. What we're seeing with teenagers is that students are interacting with their phone more than they're interacting with other people. And it's becoming more and more difficult for kids to interact with each other. It is even more uncomfortable doing nothing. So I'm going to do an exercise for a second. We are just going to be here with no sound for 1 minute. That was 20 seconds. We as adults sometimes have a hard time with silence and no stimulation. Imagine what happens to a child that has been raised by a screen since age 2 months. Dopamine is the chemical in the brain that oftentimes leads to addiction, like cocaine use, that is firing off the dopamine receptors. So screens ultimately lead to addiction. It leads to increased interpersonal conflict, like the sixth graders at the school that I used to work at. They were not super nice to each other, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how, because they were being raised by screens, which meant decreased social emotional learning skills, decreased social skills, and they needed extra guidance on how to navigate those kinds of things. It makes it so much harder to deal with boredom. How many of you parents out here have heard from your child, "I'm bored"? A better question is, how often do you hear that a day? Especially when you say, "No more screens." It's hard to know what to do with yourself without a screen, especially when that's the new norm. That's the norm for education these days, which isn't inherently a bad thing. It can be used as a tool, but when it's used excessively, it can cause issues. On this slide, you'll notice I put anxiety twice, and that was intentional, because anxiety and stress can oftentimes be misinterpreted as the same thing. And for the remainder of this presentation today, I want to talk about how to really address the anxiety and stress related to it. Because a lot of what these kids need is not for the anxiety to be taken away, but more so a tolerance to be grown. In the therapy realm, we call it a distress tolerance. So before we get started, what is the definition of anxiety? Anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. So when kids are using screens all the time and then it's not there, they're waiting for the next thing. Almost as if they're waiting for the next piece of dopamine to hit their brain, the next pleasure receptor to be hit. And when it doesn't come, they don't know what to do with themselves. Anxiety is one of many emotions. Anxiety is related to the emotion of fear,
It's an emotion that doesn't feel very good. It's up for debate. There are some clinicians that say there are positive emotions and negative emotions. There's good emotions, there's bad emotions. I disagree with both of those categorizations. Because there's no emotion that's inherently bad, there's no emotion that's inherently wrong or negative. They just are. It's what we do with them that can be categorized as good or bad. My supervisor, when I was getting my master's degree, categorized them as comfortable and uncomfortable. So joy and excitement would be one that's more comfortable. Anxiety, fear, sadness is one of those that is a little bit more uncomfortable. And it's the uncomfortable ones that can oftentimes lead us to do things that aren't great. Like we see kids that get angry and they end up like punching their sister, which isn't a great idea, right? It's more so the behavior that's associated with the emotion that is maybe not so great. And so what is really important it's important to teach kids this, because if they understand what this uncomfortable emotion like anxiety will do to their behavior, like say mean things to somebody else because they're uncomfortable and don't know what to do in social situations, it's important to know that so that we can effectively intervene in those various situations. So anxiety is one of those emotions that is designed to protect us. So way back in the caveman days, where humans had to go and survive off the land, where there are animals and other people groups that may be out there to hurt other humans, the anxiety levels had to be up, because ultimately they're like, they need to be able to survive, and anxiety is one of those things to protect us as humans. A lot of professional athletes will purposefully make themselves anxious in order to perform. So again, it's not inherently a bad emotion. It can be used for something beneficial. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And so one of the big things that, like when we're thinking about anxiety, that it can cause us to do, not just kids, but us as adults as well, is it can cause us to fight, flight, or freeze. Who's heard of that phrase before? Okay. It can often be associated with a trauma response, which we won't talk about today, but just something for you to go look up on your own. One that is not addressed in that phrase is a fourth one called fawn. And I think it's important to be aware of that one too, because oftentimes kids that get anxious, they tend to go inward and isolate themselves. And that is technically fawn. Fawn is going within and just doing what somebody else says to appease them. So that's a little bit of what anxiety causes individuals to do. Now, who has seen Inside Out 2? Okay, those who are not raising their hand should go see it, because I think it gives the best visual representation of what anxiety does, okay, especially to kiddos. So when people experience anxiety, their heart rate goes up, their muscles start to get tense, sometimes they start sweating, they start overthinking. There's this phrase called catastrophic thinking, which is going worst case scenario. For those of you who've seen the movie, there's a whole section of Riley's brain that is designed for playing out future scenarios, worst case scenarios, and and ultimately in order to protect her. But what it does is it prevents her from being in the moment, and it causes her to make some not so great decisions because she's anxious about the unknown of the future. It can also cause individuals to have a difficult time focusing. If a kiddo is just thinking over and over and over again about one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, it can be really hard to focus in the classroom. Talked about a number of these, when it comes to like interacting amongst other kids and teachers, kids and parents, kids and siblings, anxiety can cause kids to say things that are inappropriate, whether it be just inappropriate language in general, or things that like calling other people names or just being offensive to other people, simply because they just don't know what to do in those kinds of situations. When at the beginning I was talking a little bit about social emotional learning, and I want to kind of go back to that piece. If children are being raised by screens in times that traditionally kids are supposed to be interacting with their peers, that screen time is taking away vital social interaction. And that social interaction is not just to teach them social skills, but to experience emotional responses from other individuals. So here's an example. Let's say that a 5-year-old goes up to another 5-year-old and calls them a name that is really offensive. And that the reaction of that child whose name was called is going to cause that kid to maybe start crying, maybe run away, to maybe call that other person a name. And that social interaction is teaching both parties that calling people names has a consequence. It causes an emotional reaction. You get what's called nonverbal communication. So like the communication of what the body says, right? So like if we look at me up here on stage, you can probably see a lot about my body language. I'm pretty stiff, pretty tense. I don't really move a whole lot. I'm probably a little bit anxious, right? Same thing happens with kids though. Like you can see that for me, but the same thing happens with kids on more of a subconscious level. But it's those interactions that need to happen in order for kids to be able to learn how to interact, to learn that it's okay to be anxious when interacting with other people. But what's most important is to be able to push through some of that anxiety. So, what can we do about this anxiety? For any of you that has experienced anxiety at one point, what are some things that may have helped you like decrease some of your anxiety as an adult? Those who feel comfortable enough to share. You can just shout it out.
What can you do? What can I do to make this better? You know, what types of things are in my control?
Yeah, okay, so what are some things that, like, tell yourself, what are in my control to be able to do to make things better? Right. Yeah, that's great.
Tip scales.
Tip scales. Tell me more.
The tip skills, the DBT.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a therapist, so I know what you're talking about. But would you mind sharing a little bit for everybody else?
Intense exercise, pace breathing, what's the other ones? Oh, count 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
Go through all senses.
Yeah. Yeah, so intense exercise, go through all the senses. So go.
Want something cold on your temperature change.
Temperature change.
That's the key.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a combination of being able to regulate your nervous system, but also like shocking your nervous system at the same time. So what he was talking about with the 5 senses, when somebody is really anxious and doesn't really know what to do, they're kind of thinking in their emotional brain. Their emotional brain is not, there's no logic happening. And so with sensory overload, you can help direct individuals, like especially kids, to focus on various senses. So focusing on 5 things that you can see and have them vocalize it. Have them vocalize 4 things that they can hear, 3 things that they can touch, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. So having them go through all of those senses can be really helpful. One thing that we haven't talked about today is anxiety or panic attacks. That's kind of when the nervous system is on overload, where breathing really increases, heart rate increases. Sometimes there can be chest pain, and with those, kids or adults, their nervous system really needs to be shocked. So oftentimes, I'll encourage people to have like a really sour candy like on hand that they can take that will help ground them. Chewing on an ice cube, having a tablespoon of hot sauce, something to help shock their nervous system back to the ground, essentially. Now, in the context of screens and how screens influence anxiety, some things that you can do as parents and as families is encouraging social interaction in person amongst peers in place of communicating with their friends over screens. I have a good friend that is a teacher in the Grand Rapids Christian Public School or Christian school system, and they have added a class to their curriculum that is basically a life skills class where they are required to do group discussion every class period. And this friend of mine says it's like pulling teeth for high schoolers to interact with each other. And especially for elementary school kids, we can start improving that now at a young age. Encouraging interaction between kids and adults. That is really important on a number of different levels. One, it helps teach kids that it's okay to talk to adults, because that can be really scary and anxiety-inducing from time to time. Number 2, it can teach kids how to how to interact with somebody who's safe. Number 3, it teaches just respectful relationships with older individuals. Obviously, like one of the things that you can do about screens is like having no screen time, but making that like a family thing, or like a household thing, that for a specific period of time, all the phones go into this basket, it goes up in the cupboard, and we're not going to turn on the TV. We may do like a family game night, but like making that like a regular thing. Participation in outdoor activities. You over there, you said that intense exercise was one thing that is really helpful for anxiety, and I can't stress that enough. We were talking about the dopamine hits. Dopamine is a pleasure receptor. Serotonin is another pleasure receptor that goes on in the brain. And physical exercise it causes the body to have stress, and serotonin is what brings the body back to what's called equilibrium. So it's the body's natural like stress relief happening in a more appropriate and expected bodily function. Limit yelling inside the home. If I were to yell into this microphone, which I'm not going to do because that would cause lots of loud noises, and you probably would never come back to one of these again. But if I were to do that, ultimately, like, your defense mechanisms would go up. And if that happens with adults, it's going to happen with kids too. It's going to cause anxiety levels to go up, and it's going to cause a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn situation. And that doesn't help kids deal with their anxiety. It allows their anxiety to control their decision making. Avoid asking why questions to your kids. This is a hard one, but the reasons behind why me as a clinician oftentimes instruct parents to avoid using why is because it automatically comes from a place of judgment. And the reality is most kids don't know the answer to why they're doing something. Like, why did you say that to Timmy? Or why were you running in Target? Oftentimes they just don't have the self-awareness to be able to figure that out. So my challenge is to all parents is to try and figure out how to ask the same question but using a different question word. Like, what are the things that contributed? Or like, what made this decision a good one? Those kinds of things. Other ways that you can help your kids alleviate anxiety. Listening to music, specifically like calming music. Mindfulness activities. Who here has ever heard of the term mindfulness? Okay. Mindfulness is forcing you to focus on different sensations related to your body. Like, you're all sitting in the chair, noticing what your own weight feels like sitting in that chair, noticing what your heart rate is doing at a specific point in time. Notice what your muscle tension is like at specific points in your body. And YouTube has, I know we were talking about screens, but YouTube and Spotify has some really great mindfulness and guided meditation videos and audios, so that you don't have to focus on that for yourself. You can have somebody else's voice do that for you, tell you what parts of your body to focus on. Deep breathing exercises. This is one that oftentimes gets misunderstood, like just telling a kiddo to breathe, and that's great, but like, what if they're breathing too fast? What if they're not breathing fast enough? So there's some various like deep breathing exercises that you can use. One of them is prompting a kiddo to like put their hand on their belly and breathe in for 5 seconds, 5 slow seconds, because when anxiety levels are really high, the brain is firing on all cylinders. We need to reduce that to maybe firing on 2 or 3 cylinders. So forcing them to slow down their breathing can help slow down the anxiety. Another one that I like to use with kids is telling them to put their palm out like this, and then each time they breathe in, they move one of their fingers up a finger, and in the valley, they breathe it out. And it just goes up and down like that. It adds an extra sensory aspect to it. Makes it more impactful, especially for kids that just want things to do. I talked about physical activity. Drawing and coloring is a great one. Just having coloring breaks if they're feeling overwhelmed. Writing if they're old enough to do that. Whenever kids are overwhelmed emotionally, well, not just kids, but adults as well, that's all this emotion going on in their head, and they don't know what to do with it. It needs to get out somehow. So physical activity is a great way for that. Writing, drawing, coloring are also ways of being able to get that emotion out. Fidget toys, they are great to a point, right? They're great when they use them appropriately, and that's where there may be a consequence if they don't use it appropriately. Then maybe you direct them to use a different skill to help decrease their anxiety. Now, I just threw a ton of information at you all at once, and I don't expect you to really remember any of it. It's a great thing that they are recording this. But there are some additional resources beyond just what I shared today. What I shared today is just the tip of the iceberg. There's way more information than I could really talk about in an hour's time. When it decides to go to the next slide, there's a couple of websites that are really great for parents. So one of them is called edutopia.org. This is a website that's mainly designed for educators, but it has a wide array of really great social emotional learning information for parents and for teachers. Now, I have a picture of George Lucas on here. Mistake. George Lucas, he's, for those of you who don't know, he's the creator of Star Wars, but he's also the creator of edutopia.org. So a lot of people don't know is George Lucas has a degree in anthropology, and that is basically the study of human existence and the study of various cultures and what makes various people groups different than others. And when he was raising his children, he saw that there was a significant need of teachers needing assistance in terms of teaching kids how to better understand their emotions and how that impacts social interaction. So he essentially made this foundation, EduTopia, to help provide free resources for teachers. Again, teachers mainly, but there's lots of really good information on there for parents as well. This next resource, parentandteen.com. This is run by the Center for Parent and Teen Communication in Pittsburgh. I had the pleasure of going to a conference where the creator of that organization was there and literally talked about resilience for a whole 8-hour day. And he created this website because he saw that there was a need for parents for parents who needed resources to communicate with their teenager better. And not just teenager, but their kids as a whole. So this website is phenomenal. It has resources for teens having a hard time communicating with their parents. It has information about parents that are having a hard time communicating with their kids. It has various like intervention strategies when like unhelpful behavior happens inside the home, with their friends, whatever. It's a really wonderful resource for parents. And then the Calm app. Who here has heard of the Calm app? It's advertised everywhere. It was actually a masterclass that I listened to on the Calm app that kind of drove me down this path of helping better understand the effects of screens and children's emotional development. So they have both mindfulness resources. If you're like, your kid's overwhelmed, you don't know what to do, go into the Calm app. They have like tons of different suggestions that you can use just offhand. And that is all I have for you today. I wanted to leave some time for questions if anybody had any, but I really appreciate you inviting me here to speak with you today. Thank you. Yes?
I just wonder, do you have any advice on increasing a child's distress tolerance or window of tolerance when they get into these uncomfortable situations?
Yeah, so let me make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly. Do I have any insight about increasing somebody's distress tolerance when they're in this overwhelmed scenario? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, for example, like if a kid is using screens all the time and then you decide, okay, I want to scale back, and it's very like dysregulating for the child, how to kind of scale up.
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with having small victories, right? If a kiddo is on a screen for 8 hours a day, maybe scaling it back to 7 hours and 30 minutes, and seeing how that goes, right? And just like slowly weaning off a kiddo like that. Because if you stop cold turkey, it's going to be a nightmare for everybody, right? Similar to like with, like think about it from like an addiction perspective. Like relapse prevention from a substance abuse perspective will oftentimes lead to relapse, and recovery is just not super feasible long term. If we take away a kid's screens when he's been used to it 8 hours a day, he's going to do whatever he can to try and get that screen back, right? So like starting off small and weaning himself out that way is going to help start increase that distress tolerance. Because if we go 8-0 or even 8-4, it's going to be a little bit too, it's likely to be too overwhelming. Because that way he's at like a distress tolerance level that is a little bit more manageable and more receptive to what parents have to say instead of full-blown meltdown. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. Thanks again. Oh, I turned it off already. Thanks again.